The sun shone brightly through the tall glass windows of the Grand City Bank, illuminating polished marble floors and the calm, everyday hustle of a Monday morning. Customers shuffled in and out, tellers worked behind counters, and the faint hum of computers mixed with the soft murmur of conversations. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, ordinary. And then, chaos erupted. From the street, 3 masked men burst into the bank. Guns in hand, faces hidden behind ski masks, their eyes gleamed with arrogance and the thrill of crime. They moved quickly, confidently, as if the world owed them obedience. The leader barked orders. "Everyone down! Move!" Shoppers screamed and dove for cover. Some ducked behind counters, clutching their purses, while others froze, too shocked to react. The air was suddenly thick with tension, a dangerous energy that made hearts pound and palms sweat. The robbers weren't subtle. They slammed their weapons on counters, shouting at the tellers to hand over money. Fear filled the room. But in the center of it all, one man remained completely calm. Steven Seagal. He stood near the lobby center, his hands relaxed at his sides, his face unreadable. Jeans, leather jacket, quiet presence. No panic, no hesitation, no guards, just a man who had seen more chaos than anyone else in the room could imagine. He didn't flinch when a gun was waved in his direction. He didn't even move. Customers noticed him, some with wide eyes, some whispering. Who is that?" The robbers laughed at his stillness. "Move aside, old man, or you'll get hurt," one sneered. They assumed calm meant fear. They assumed arrogance meant weakness. But they were wrong. Steven's gaze scanned the room. Every exit, every hostage, every weak point. His calm was not ignorance, it was preparation. Every move the robbers made, every shift in their stance, he noted. And he waited. Patience was his weapon. The leader grabbed a teller by the shoulder, demanding cash, throwing threats over his shoulder. Some customers screamed, others prayed silently, everyone's attention was on the chaos, except Steven. He didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't react. And that was the moment the robbers made their first mistake. They underestimated him. The robbers, laughing and joking among themselves, were completely unaware that they had just walked into a nightmare. The daylight outside made it clear, this would not be a robbery anyone would forget. The air, once filled with normal Monday energy, now carried tension so thick it was almost visible. Every eye in the bank was on Steven now, though most didn't understand why. And then, without warning, the calm man in the jacket made a move. A subtle shift of his weight. A tiny step forward. No one noticed. But in that single second, the balance of power in the room changed. The robbers still thought escape was easy. That assumption would cost them everything. Because in a moment, the quietest man in the room would turn their confident heist into a nightmare they would never survive. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Grand City Bank, reflecting off the polished marble floors and creating a calm, almost serene atmosphere. Outside, traffic moved lazily, and people strolled down the sidewalks with coffees in hand, unaware of the storm about to hit their quiet day. Inside, everything seemed ordinary. Customers waited patiently in line, tellers counted cash behind the counters, and the soft hum of computers filled the air. At the center of this controlled chaos, or what appeared to be chaos, was bank manager Clark. Strutting through the lobby like he owned every inch of it, Clark's polished shoes clicked against the floor, his gold watch glinting in the sunlight. He barked orders at the staff, corrected their posture, and gave exaggerated smiles to customers as if performing in a scene he himself had written. To him, power meant control, and control meant belittling anyone who dared to challenge his authority, even subtly. "Move faster! That line isn't going to wait all day," he snapped at a young teller, pointing at her with a finger dripping with arrogance. The teller flinched, lowering her eyes. Clark thrived on these moments, the small demonstrations of dominance that made him feel untouchable. He didn't notice the subtle tension in the room, the way some customers exchanged uneasy glances, or the quiet presence approaching the entrance. And then he did. A man walked in. No fanfare. No bodyguards. No flashy car. No aggressive energy. Just calm, collected confidence. Jeans. A faded leather jacket. Simple shoes. A face that carried decades of experience but revealed nothing about his intentions. The man moved deliberately, scanning the lobby briefly before approaching the counter. His steps were quiet, almost meditative, yet each step seemed to demand the attention of everyone in the room. Steven Seagal. Clark, preoccupied with asserting his authority, didn't notice the man's quiet entrance at first. But when he did, he sneered inwardly. Just another ordinary customer, he thought. Hopefully not another lazy daydreamer thinking he can waltz in and impress me. Steven walked up to the counter and calmly placed a small envelope in front of the teller. "I'd like to deposit this check," he said, his voice steady and measured. No arrogance. No demand. Just a simple request. Clark leaned over the counter, peering down at the man like a predator inspecting prey. "Sir, this counter is for real clients, not dreamers," he said, smirking. "We have rules here." "I just want to deposit a check," Steven replied evenly, without rising to the bait. Clark laughed, loud and condescending. "Oh, sure. Let's see how small this check really is." He reached for the envelope with exaggerated curiosity, giving the impression he was about to inspect a trivial note. Staff and customers nearby began to notice the tension. Whispers spread through the room. Some recorded on their phones, curious about the quiet man who didn't flinch. Meanwhile, Steven didn't react to the mockery. His calm presence seemed almost magnetic. It drew attention, not through force, but through quiet confidence. A few people in line tilted their heads, instinctively aware that this man was unlike anyone else in the room. One elderly clerk in the back frowned, adjusting her glasses, as if something about him seemed familiar. And then Steven smiled faintly, just a hint, enough to make people notice but not enough to reveal his intentions. "Sometimes," he said softly, almost as if talking to himself, "arrogance blinds the eyes that should see." Clark barely reacted, too consumed with his own sense of superiority. He opened the envelope, expecting nothing of consequence, expecting yet another ordinary deposit. And yet, the quiet tension in the room grew, even in the bright daylight. Every person inside the bank could sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Backhand index pointing right. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And shout out to everyone who stays calm under disrespect. Humility is stronger than aggression. Clark's staff exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered, "Who is this guy?" Others tried to hide their curiosity behind forced smiles. They could feel it too, the subtle shift in energy, the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from Steven. Steven simply waited. No sudden movements, no threats, no demand for attention. Just quiet, patient presence. And in that silence, he had already claimed the power in the room. In the middle of a busy daytime bank lobby, surrounded by staff, customers, and an arrogant manager, one simple truth hung in the air: appearances can be deceiving. And those who underestimate quiet confidence often pay the price. Clark, oblivious, prepared to make the first mistake of his day, one that he would regret the moment it happened. The ordinary hum of the Grand City Bank shattered in an instant. The front doors burst open, slamming against the walls with a loud bang, and 3 masked men stormed inside, guns raised, adrenaline sharp in their eyes. The bright daylight that had bathed the lobby just seconds ago now felt oppressive, highlighting the sudden panic that swept through the room. "Everyone down! On the floor! Now!" shouted the tallest of the robbers, his voice hoarse but commanding. The customers screamed and obeyed immediately, diving for cover behind counters, chairs, and potted plants. Some fell flat to the marble floor, clutching purses and wallets, their hearts pounding, their breaths ragged. The soft clatter of dropped papers and the whir of a scared printer filled the tense silence that followed. Clark, the bank manager, froze mid-step, his arrogance momentarily replaced with fear. His golden watch glinted, but his hands trembled slightly. For a brief moment, he realized that the situation was bigger than any display of authority he had ever wielded. But one man remained utterly calm. Steven Seagal. He slowly turned his head toward the robbers. No sudden movements, no flinching, no exaggerated gestures. Just a subtle, deliberate turn, his eyes scanning their posture, their hands, their weapons, the distance to each exit. The calmness in his demeanor made him stand out from the chaos. He wasn't afraid. He was observing, calculating, waiting for the exact moment to act. The leader barked orders at the staff, waving his gun at tellers. "Hand over the money." "No tricks." The bank employees, faces pale, scrambled to comply. Cash drawers were yanked open, bills stuffed into bags, computers abandoned mid-transaction. Customers whispered frantic prayers. Some attempted to shield children, others tried desperately to remain still, hoping the robbers wouldn't notice them. One of the masked men grabbed a young clerk by the shoulder and shoved him to the side. "Move it!" he shouted, jabbing the barrel of his gun toward the terrified line of customers. Amid the shouting and chaos, Steven remained a pillar of silence. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear but in focus. He wasn't ignoring the threat, he was reading it. Every movement, every twitch of muscle, every nervous glance of the robbers revealed their weakness. And he was already formulating a plan. A bead of sweat ran down the forehead of one robber as he scanned the room. He noticed Steven standing calmly in the middle of the lobby. "Hey, don't just stand there," the robber barked, pointing his weapon at him. Steven didn't flinch. He didn't even move his lips. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying the man. The silence in response was more unnerving than the guns themselves. The leader, noticing Steven's lack of fear, laughed nervously, a sharp, forced sound. "You think you can stand there like a statue and nothing will happen? You're either crazy or stupid." Steven's eyes flickered once, almost imperceptibly, and his lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Sometimes," he said, in a voice calm and controlled, "arrogance blinds the eyes that should see." The robbers exchanged uneasy glances. Their confidence wavered slightly. They were used to fear, compliance, and trembling. Not stillness. Not quiet authority. A heavy silence fell over part of the lobby. Customers whispered, some peeking from behind counters, wondering about this strange man. A child clutched her mother's arm and whispered, "Mom, why isn't he scared?" And then it happened. One of the robbers, growing impatient, waved his gun closer to Steven, yelling, "Step aside, old man! Don't make me shoot!" Steven didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply tilted his shoulder slightly, positioning himself just enough to see all three exits. Every robber's foot placement, every hand gesture, every subtle shift in balance, was noted. Backhand index pointing right. What would you do if you were trapped inside this bank right now? Could you stay calm, or would panic take over? Comment below. I want to know how you would react in a moment like this. The tension became almost unbearable. One robber fumbled with his mask, wiping sweat from his brow, his confidence fading. The leader barked louder, waving his gun in a panicked, shaky motion. The daylight, which moments ago had been comforting, now reflected off polished floors and walls, highlighting the fear in every customer's eyes. Steven's calmness seemed to amplify the chaos. The robbers' confidence cracked with every second. They assumed control, but they hadn't accounted for someone who didn't respond to intimidation. Someone whose calm was a weapon in itself. Every person in the room, Clark, tellers, customers, felt the shift. The air was thick with anticipation. Every heartbeat echoed in the marble lobby. It was clear, the robbery wasn't going as the criminals planned. And one man, silent and still, was about to turn their plan into a nightmare they would never forget. The bank lobby, once bright and calm, had transformed into a tense battlefield. Guns shook in hands, customers crouched in fear, and the faint scent of fear mixed with the faint aroma of polished wood and paper. The robbers were beginning to realize that this wasn't just another easy daylight heist. The leader, mask slightly askew, waved his gun aggressively at the tellers. "Move faster! Fill the bags!" His voice, once commanding, now carried a hint of uncertainty. The other two robbers glanced nervously at Steven, the quiet man who refused to comply with their intimidation. One of them, a younger man with twitching hands, moved toward Steven, thinking that fearlessness was a challenge that needed to be corrected. "Hey, I said move. Don't test me," he barked. Steven didn't flinch. He simply turned his gaze toward the robber, slow and deliberate, eyes cold and assessing. He shifted his weight subtly, a small but precise motion that sent a ripple of unease through the masked man. The robber's confidence faltered. He noticed the calm dominance that radiated from Steven, a power that didn't shout or threaten, it simply existed. The leader noticed the subtle shift in his accomplice. "What are you doing?" "Focus," "The old man isn't worth your attention," he snapped. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Steven, taking in every detail of the room, didn't speak. His movements were measured, almost meditative. Each second he remained calm, the robbers grew more reckless. They began yelling over each other, gesturing wildly, their coordination breaking down. Bags of money were half filled, spilled coins scattered across the marble floor, and the faint clink of loose change echoed ominously. And then the first critical mistake happened. The leader, frustrated, gestured toward Steven with his gun. "Move or I shoot," he shouted, his voice sharp but unsteady. Steven tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped, just enough to reposition himself between the leader and a cluster of customers. No sudden moves, no dramatic gestures. Just a precise shift that subtly altered the battlefield. The robber, unprepared, stumbled slightly forward. He cursed under his breath, glancing at his companions for support. But the other two robbers were already reacting unpredictably. Panic was spreading faster than their plan could recover. Steven's calmness wasn't just about control, it was psychological. Every flicker of fear, every hesitation, every moment of doubt the robbers felt was amplified by his stillness. He didn't need to strike yet. The fear in their eyes, the crack in their confidence, was already a weapon. Customers began to notice the change. Whispers ran through the room. "Is he going to do something?" Some peeked over counters, phones in hand, recording the unfolding drama. A mother shielded her child and whispered, "Look at him, he's not afraid." One of the robbers, now panicked, shouted at Steven, "I said get out of my way. Now." Instead of answering, Steven's hand moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward the counter. Not in haste, not in threat, just a smooth, precise motion. He picked up a small item, a pen, seemingly insignificant, and twirled it between his fingers. The robbers didn't understand the subtlety. But in that single gesture, he had already begun controlling the environment. The leader cursed, waving his gun erratically. "What is he doing? Get him! Don't just stand there!" Steven's eyes shifted, scanning the exits, the positions of the robbers, and the frightened customers. He was calculating every angle, anticipating every reaction. In another instant, one robber lunged toward him, thinking that intimidation would force compliance. Steven didn't dodge in panic. He sidestepped with controlled precision, guiding the man past him in such a way that the robber's momentum nearly caused him to collide with his own partner. A loud thud echoed through the lobby as the man stumbled, off balance. The leader barked, but his voice was losing authority with every second. Chaos spread among the robbers. The younger one fumbled with a bag, spilling bills and coins across the marble floor. The leader tried to regain control, shouting over the commotion, but it was too late. Panic had replaced confidence. Every move Steven made was deliberate, silent, and controlled. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to strike immediately. His presence alone had destabilized the robbers, turning their carefully planned daylight heist into confusion. And just as the robbers realized they were losing control, Steven took one more small, calculated step forward. It wasn't a threat, it was positioning. The shift alone was enough to block their escape route subtly, forcing them to consider the possibility that they might not leave the bank alive. The air was thick with tension. Customers watched in stunned silence, some barely breathing, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The daylight that had seemed ordinary now shone harshly on the scene, illuminating fear, confusion, and the unshakable calm of the man who had turned their perfect plan upside down. Every robber in that lobby, for the first time, felt the chilling reality of underestimating Steven Seagal. The nightmare had begun. The tension in the Grand City Bank had reached a breaking point. The robbers, once confident and in control, were now frantically trying to recover from the subtle but relentless dominance of the quiet man in the leather jacket. Their daylight heist, which they had imagined would be simple and profitable, was spiraling into chaos before it even reached its climax. Steven Seagal didn't rush. He didn't yell. He didn't make dramatic movements. He simply stepped forward, calm and deliberate, his eyes scanning every robber, every hostage, every potential obstacle. His presence alone radiated authority, a quiet power that no amount of shouting or gun-waving could counter. The leader, trying desperately to regain control, waved his gun. Everyone listen. Move. Grab the money and get out. Now. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear that Steven's calmness had sown. The other two robbers exchanged panicked glances. Their movements were jerky, uncoordinated. Coins spilled from the bag, bills fluttered to the marble floor like terrified birds, and the clatter echoed ominously. Steven's gaze locked on the youngest robber, the one who had lunged at him earlier. The man's hands shook, and he adjusted his mask nervously, clearly questioning his own choices for the first time. Steven took another small step forward, positioning himself strategically. He wasn't just walking, he was orchestrating the room. Every movement subtly shifted the robbers' balance, forcing them into mistakes without lifting a finger aggressively. And then it happened. The young robber lunged again, this time more recklessly, hoping to intimidate Steven with sheer aggression. But Steven was ready. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped and guided the man past him, redirecting the robber's momentum so that he stumbled into his own partner. A loud crash reverberated through the bank as the two men collided and fell, their guns clattering to the marble floor. Panic surged in the leader's eyes. Steven's calm gaze didn't waver. He bent slightly, picking up the gun nearest to him. Not to threaten, not to attack, but to display control. The robbers froze. The daylight streaming through the windows reflected off the metal, highlighting the authority in his hands. The leader shouted, voice cracking, What are you doing?" Steven didn't answer. He let the silence speak. His eyes, steady and unwavering, were louder than any words could be. Every customer in the bank, still crouched and terrified, could see the shift. The predator had become prey, and the prey, the quiet man, was now the undeniable force in the room. He moved with precision, each step calculated. The young robber tried to scramble toward the door, thinking escape was still possible. Steven intercepted him effortlessly, stepping into the path and gently but firmly guiding the man back toward the center of the room. The robber's confidence crumbled. He realized that every instinct he had relied upon was failing him. The leader's hands trembled as he aimed his weapon, but Steven's presence was too commanding, too overwhelming. One subtle tilt of his head, one faint step forward, and the leader's focus broke. He accidentally knocked over a chair, which crashed loudly to the floor. In that instant, both robbers froze, their morale shattered. Steven's calm wasn't just intimidating, it was strategic. He controlled the room without yelling, without running, without a single excessive motion. The robbers' daylight heist had been reduced to confusion and fear, their perfect plan undone by a man who understood power without needing to assert it loudly. Customers peeked from behind counters, phones raised, capturing the impossible scene unfolding. Whispers ran through the lobby. Is he really just standing there? He's not afraid at all. The mother shielding her child whispered, Look at him, he's in complete control. And then the final domino fell. One of the robbers, panicked and desperate, made a move toward the exit. Steven shifted slightly, just enough to block the path, guiding the man back without confrontation. The robber stumbled, losing his balance entirely, falling hard against a marble column. His gun skidded across the floor. The leader, seeing his crew incapacitated, raised his hands frantically. Stop! Stop! I give up! Don't hurt me! Steven didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded, a subtle acknowledgement of their surrender. The authority in that motion was absolute. The robbers, fully aware they had been outmatched, froze in place, defeated by a calm, measured force rather than aggression. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but the robbers didn't move. They were trapped not just physically, but mentally, having realized they had underestimated someone who had turned their daylight heist into a nightmare in minutes. Every person in the bank could feel the magnitude of what had just occurred. One man, silent and controlled, had defeated armed criminals without a single reckless act. Backhand index pointing right. Should criminals fear calm men like Steven? Comment yes or no. Would you stand your ground, or would fear take over? Steven lowered the gun to the counter, motioning subtly for the robbers to stay still. Customers exhaled slowly, relief washing over them. The daylight that had once illuminated the bank in ordinary peace now highlighted the aftermath of control, precision, and undeniable authority. In the end, the robbers were no longer a threat. Their confidence destroyed, their plan ruined, and their freedom temporarily stripped away, all by the quiet power of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to dominate the room. Daylight had witnessed the transformation, from chaos to calm, from fear to control, from arrogance to humility. And the man at the center of it all? Steven Seagal, unshaken, standing as the silent force that had turned a bank heist into a nightmare the criminals would never forget. The wail of sirens grew louder outside the Grand City Bank, cutting through the tension that had gripped the lobby for what felt like hours. Customers began to realize that the nightmare they had been trapped in was finally coming to an end. Armed robbers, once filled with confidence and arrogance, were now flattened by fear, their plan completely destroyed. Steven Seagal stood in the center of the lobby, his presence calm and unyielding. His eyes scanned the room one last time, checking on the hostages, the tellers, and even the terrified manager, Clark. Every movement he made was deliberate, controlled, and silent, yet it communicated far more authority than shouting ever could. The daylight streaming through the glass windows highlighted his figure, casting long, quiet shadows across the floor, shadows that symbolized the dominance he had just exerted. Clark, still trembling, sank to his knees behind a counter, hands shaking. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." His voice broke, laden with fear and regret. The arrogance that had consumed him mere minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a deep awareness of the consequences of underestimating someone. Steven's gaze softened slightly but remained firm. "That's exactly the problem," he said evenly. "You shouldn't have to know everything. Respect isn't about who is rich or who has authority. It's about how you treat others, even when no one is watching." Outside, police cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured out, guns drawn, but the situation inside had already been controlled. Steven calmly gestured toward the robbers. "Stay where you are. The authorities will handle the rest." The robbers, now fully subdued, sat on the marble floor, their weapons clattering beside them. Their arrogance had been replaced with exhaustion and fear. They realized that their daylight heist, which they had thought would be easy, had been dismantled by a man who didn't need to shout, who didn't need to charge. They had been undone by his calm, calculated presence. Police officers moved quickly, cuffing the robbers and securing the lobby. They glanced at Steven, some in awe, others in disbelief. A uniformed officer approached cautiously. "Sir, we handled them, but that was incredible. How did you?" Steven shook his head slightly. "It wasn't about me. It's about control. About observing. About remaining calm when everyone else panics." He gave the officer a measured nod, a gesture that carried both acknowledgement and authority. The hostages slowly rose from their crouched positions, shaking, whispering words of relief. A few patrons recorded the scene on their phones, some whispering about the quiet man who had just saved them without a single reckless move. Children, still clinging to their parents, peeked curiously at Steven, sensing the unshakable calm radiating from him. Clark's eyes were glued to Steven. He finally understood the lesson he had been blind to for so long. Power and respect are not about arrogance or loud displays. True strength lies in discipline, in measured action, and in the courage to remain composed when others crumble. Steven glanced at Clark. "You have a choice now," he said softly. "You can continue to lead through intimidation, or you can learn humility. Choose wisely." Clark swallowed hard. I understand, sir. I promise to change. Truly." Steven nodded once and turned toward the old clerk who had quietly stayed composed throughout the chaos. She had remained calm, respectful, and professional, never letting fear drive her actions. "From today," Steven said, "you're the new branch manager." Her eyes widened, a mixture of shock and gratitude. "Sir, I thank you." Outside, the police finished securing the building. Officers guided the robbers out, ensuring they would face justice. Customers and staff began to slowly regain composure, some calling loved ones, others quietly thanking Steven for his presence. He didn't linger. There was no celebration, no fanfare. Just quiet resolution. He walked toward the exit, each step deliberate, his calm presence still commanding attention. The daylight caught his jacket, the faint gleam of his watch, and the steady, controlled motion of a man who had turned chaos into order without shouting or spectacle. As he passed through the lobby, whispers followed him. Who was that man? He didn't even raise his voice. That was incredible. Steven opened the door, stepping into the bright daylight outside, leaving behind a bank filled with people who had learned an unforgettable lesson. Arrogance and aggression can be defeated not by force, but by calm, measured strength. Respect, after all, is earned silently. Even as the sirens faded and the city returned to its normal pace, the story of the daylight heist, turned nightmare, would linger in the minds of every person in that bank. And the one man who had orchestrated it all? He had vanished as quietly as he had arrived, leaving only the lesson and the memory of true power. The daylight now felt calm again, but the energy of the morning had been forever altered. Chaos had come, arrogance had challenged, and discipline had conquered. And everyone who witnessed it, customers, staff, and even the humbled manager, knew that they had seen something extraordinary. The sun was now higher in the sky, bathing the city streets in brilliant daylight, yet inside the Grand City Bank, a calm had settled after the chaos. The echo of sirens had faded, the masked robbers were in police custody, and customers were cautiously returning to their feet. But more than the relief, more than the adrenaline slowly draining from frightened bodies, there was a silent awareness that lingered in the room, a lesson etched in every eye, every whispered word, every heartbeat. Steven Seagal had left the building as quietly as he had entered. No applause. No attention. Just the faint sound of his steps on the marble floor, then silence. Yet his presence, though gone, still dominated the room. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It had been about the way he carried himself, the way he observed, measured, and acted with precision when everyone else had panicked. Clark, the former arrogant branch manager, sat behind the counter, his head lowered, still trembling. The golden watch on his wrist now seemed heavy, a symbol of misplaced pride and authority. I didn't see it, he muttered to himself. I didn't see the man. I didn't see my mistakes. The old clerk, who had remained calm and respectful throughout the ordeal, approached him quietly. Sometimes, she said softly, it's the quiet ones who teach the loudest lessons. Clark's gaze lifted, and he finally met her eyes. In that moment, humility was no longer an abstract concept. It was real. It was personal. And it was unavoidable. Steven's actions had demonstrated something deeper than bravery. It wasn't the fight that had mattered, nor the display of skill. It was the presence of mind, the ability to stay composed under pressure, and the understanding that true power does not scream for attention, it commands it silently. Every robber in that bank had learned this the hard way. Every customer had witnessed it. And Clark, for once, had understood that respect must be earned, not demanded. The story of the daylight robbery would spread quickly. People would talk about how three masked men, confident in their plans, had been undone not by a gun or a chase, but by a man who stood calmly and observed. Social media would light up with videos, whispers of awe, and admiration for the quiet strength that had turned a potentially tragic event into a controlled resolution. But Steven never sought recognition. That had never been his purpose. He had taught the bank something far more valuable than money could measure. He had taught them about human character, about humility, about strength, about respect. Clark, still shaken, spoke quietly to the staff. From now on, I will remember this. I will remember that arrogance blinds, and calmness conquers. I have been humbled. His voice cracked, but it carried the weight of sincerity. For once, the lesson was not theoretical. It was a living truth, engraved by fear, awe, and observation. The old clerk, now promoted to branch manager, walked slowly to the front of the lobby. Customers who had been too scared to move now began to approach, offering thanks, some with tears in their eyes. She nodded politely, quietly aware that the calmness of one man had saved everyone from harm and had also taught them the value of restraint and respect. And somewhere outside, in the sunlight, Steven Seagal walked away. Not victorious in a loud or boastful way, but victorious in the quiet, enduring way of someone who knew that true power doesn't need to announce itself. Every step was measured. Every movement purposeful. He left no trace of his presence except for the lesson, etched into the minds of everyone in that bank. Backhand index pointing right, type respect in the comments if you believe humility is real strength. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to thank every kind soul personally. The moral of the story was clear. Respect isn't reserved for the rich, the famous, or the loudest voices in the room. Respect is shown to everyone, especially when no one is watching. It's easy to command attention with power, wealth, or intimidation. But it takes true character to act with patience, precision, and calm under pressure. In the end, the robbers had left defeated, not because they were physically overpowered, but because they underestimated someone who did not need to act aggressively to assert dominance. The lesson was universal: arrogance blinds. Fear feeds itself. Calmness conquers. The city would go on. The bank would reopen fully. Some would remember the day as a scary incident, but those who witnessed it fully understood something deeper. They had seen an example of quiet authority, and they had learned how fleeting arrogance can be when confronted by discipline. And as for Steven Seagal, his role was complete. There was no celebration, no media coverage for himself, no accolades. Just the knowledge that he had restored order, protected lives, and imparted a lesson louder than any shouted command. He had transformed a daylight robbery into a story of courage, humility, and silent power, a story that would be told for years, not for the violence he prevented, but for the respect he commanded without ever demanding it. Day turned to afternoon, and the bank was quiet again. Sunlight reflected off the polished floors, but the lesson lingered. Every customer, every teller, every staff member who had witnessed the events that morning carried with them a piece of that lesson. True strength is silent. True respect is earned. And in a world that often praises loudness over wisdom, power over humility, and chaos over calm, the story of Steven Seagal's daylight confrontation remained a timeless reminder that character, patience, and controlled authority can change outcomes far more than force ever could.